Welcome to our channel, where we explore the most spine-chilling tales from the darkest corners of the military world. Tonight, we bring you 5 true stories that will haunt your dreams and make you question what lurks in the shadows of our armed forces. These aren't just ghost stories or urban legends. These are real accounts from soldiers who lived through the terror. Let's dive into the first story. Story 1, The Haunted Barracks. When I first arrived at the old military barracks deep within a dense forest, there was an eerie feeling that settled over the place. These barracks had a reputation that sent shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned soldiers. The locals talked about the chilling atmosphere as if the very air whispered secrets of the past. Our unit was assigned to these barracks one quiet night. We were a tough group, unafraid of the dark or the unknown. But this place felt different. From the moment we stepped inside, an unsettling feeling washed over us. The floors creaked under our boots, cold drafts sent chills down our spines, and an eerie silence hung in the air. As night fell, the barracks seemed to come alive. At first, it was just small things, barely noticeable noises that could easily be dismissed as the wind or an old building settling. But then, things started to escalate. Private Mitchell was the first to notice. He was lying in his bunk, trying to fall asleep, when he heard a faint whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing. He sat up, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. Shaking his head, he tried to dismiss it, but the unease lingered. The next night, the whispers returned, louder this time. And they weren't alone. Shadows began to dance along the walls, moving in ways that defied logic. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, reaching out to us. We, hardened by years of combat, found ourselves unnerved by these spectral intrusions. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Sergeant Lewis decided to investigate. Armed with only a flashlight and his courage, he stepped into the hallway. The beam of light flickered, casting long, wavering shadows. Every step he took seemed to echo endlessly, amplifying the silence around him. And then he saw it. A figure, pale and translucent, standing at the end of the hall. It was a soldier, but not one of ours. His uniform was old, tattered, from a time long past. And his eyes were hollow, filled with an eternity of sorrow. As quickly as he appeared, he vanished, leaving Sergeant Lewis shaken to his core. Word of the encounter spread quickly through the unit. We were trained to face the horrors of war, but this was something else. The barracks were haunted, and the spirits of the past were making their presence known. Things really began to escalate after the initial encounters. It wasn't just the whispers or shadows anymore. We started noticing cold spots that would appear out of nowhere, chilling us to the bone despite the summer heat. Equipment malfunctioned frequently, and personal items would disappear, only to reappear in the strangest places. It felt like we were constantly being watched. One night, I was on guard duty, patrolling the perimeter of the barracks. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves and distant hoot of an owl setting me on edge. As I rounded a corner, I saw a ghostly figure standing in the moonlight. It was the same soldier Sergeant Lewis had described, with tattered uniform and hollow eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him. Suddenly, the figure began to move towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. I wanted to call out, to warn the others, but my voice seemed trapped in my throat. The temperature around me dropped sharply, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I could hear the faint whispers again, but this time they were all around me, growing louder and more insistent. I backed away, my flashlight flickering uncontrollably. Just as I turned to run, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, and there he was, face to face with the apparition. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into my soul. I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and despair wash over me, as if I could feel the soldier's pain and suffering. In that moment, I thought I was done for. But just as quickly as he appeared, the ghostly figure vanished, leaving me trembling and gasping for breath. I stumbled back to the barracks, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I told the others, the fear in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. We were no longer just soldiers facing an enemy. We were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. The haunted barracks had claimed another witness, and the terror was far from over. After my encounter with the ghostly figure, the fear among our unit was palpable. We were soldiers, trained to face any physical threat, but this was something beyond our control and understanding. The barracks felt more oppressive with each passing night, and the unexplained events only intensified. We knew we couldn't stay there much longer. The higher-ups must have sensed the growing unease because, a week after my encounter, we received orders to relocate. We packed up our gear, grateful to be leaving the haunted barracks behind. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those hollow eyes were following us. Even though we were miles away, the legend of the haunted barracks persisted. Stories of our encounters spread through the ranks, becoming more embellished with each retelling. Some said the ghost was a soldier who had died in a tragic accident, others claimed it was the spirit of a long-forgotten war. The barracks were officially marked off-limits, a decision that only fueled the rumors. Years later, I was stationed at a different base when I heard the news. A new unit had been assigned to the old barracks, despite the warnings and the stories. I couldn't believe it. Surely, they knew what they were getting into. It didn't take long for the reports to start coming in. The new soldiers experienced the same eerie whispers, the dancing shadows, the cold spots. One night, a soldier reported seeing a ghostly figure with a tattered uniform and hollow eyes. It was as if history was repeating itself. The higher-ups tried to dismiss the claims, but the fear was too real, too intense. The unit was eventually relocated, just like we had been. The barracks, once again, were left abandoned. To this day, the legend of the haunted barracks remains. New recruits hear the stories and shiver, wondering if they'll ever have to face the spirits that haunt those old, decaying walls. And every time I think back to my time there, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Some places are just meant to be left alone. Story 2, The Silent Patrol. I remember it like it was yesterday. We were deep in the dense jungles of Vietnam, far from any semblance of civilization. Our patrol unit, a tight-knit group of seasoned soldiers, was tasked with a routine reconnaissance mission. The jungle was a living, breathing entity, its thick canopy blocking out the sun, leaving us in a perpetual twilight. Every step was a struggle, the air thick with humidity and the sounds of the jungle echoing all around us. We had been moving through the dense underbrush for hours when we first noticed it. The usual cacophony of jungle sounds, the chirping of insects, the calls of distant animals, suddenly ceased. An eerie silence fell over us, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It was as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Sergeant Harris, our unit leader, raised his hand, signaling us to halt. We scanned our surroundings, trying to pinpoint the source of our unease. That's when we saw them, strange markings carved into the trees. They were unlike anything we had ever seen before, intricate patterns that seemed almost otherworldly. The markings glowed faintly, despite the lack of light. As we moved closer to investigate, the silence grew even more oppressive. It felt as though we had stepped into another realm, one where time and sound had ceased to exist. The further we went, the more markings we found, each more elaborate and disturbing than the last. It was clear that we were now alone, and whatever had made those markings was still out there, watching us. The jungle, which had once felt so alive, now felt like a tomb, its dense foliage closing in around us. We could feel eyes on us, an unseen presence that seemed to follow our every move. The air grew colder, a stark contrast to the usual oppressive heat. We were seasoned soldiers, but this was something beyond our training and comprehension. I remember Private Diaz whispering, "Do you guys feel that? It's like we're being watched." His words sent a shiver down my spine. We were trained to handle any enemy, but how do you fight something you can't see, something that seems to be everywhere and nowhere at once? As we pressed on, the silence became almost deafening. Every step we took seemed to echo in the void, our breathing loud and ragged. We knew we had to keep moving, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. We were deep in the heart of the jungle, surrounded by an unseen enemy, and the strange markings were just the beginning of our nightmare. As we pushed deeper into the jungle, the eerie silence became suffocating. The strange markings on the trees grew more frequent and more elaborate. It felt like we were walking into a trap, but we had no choice but to press on. Then it happened. Private Diaz, who had been at the rear, vanished without a trace. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the jungle. We called out for him, our voices echoing eerily in the silence, but there was no response. Our hearts pounded with fear, but we couldn't afford to lose our composure. Sergeant Harris ordered us to form a tighter formation and keep our eyes peeled. But it didn't matter. One by one, my comrades started disappearing. It was as if the jungle itself was picking us off, taking us when we least expected it. First Diaz, then Thompson, then Lee. Each time, there was no sound, no struggle, just an empty space where a soldier had been standing moments before. Panic set in. We were trained for combat, for facing visible enemies, but this was something else entirely. It felt like we were being hunted by ghosts. The markings on the trees seemed to mock us, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was as if they were guiding us deeper into the heart of the jungle, towards something we couldn't see or understand. Finally, there were only a few of us left. We huddled together, our nerves frayed, our weapons clutched tightly in our hands. The air around us grew colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. We could hear whispers now, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. And then we saw them, shadows moving through the trees, too fast and too silent to be human. They surrounded us, their forms flickering in and out of sight. We opened fire, but our bullets seemed to pass right through them. The shadows closed in, and we were trapped, with no way out. Sergeant Harris shouted orders, trying to maintain control, but it was no use. The shadows were upon us, their presence overwhelming. It felt like the jungle itself was alive, reaching out to claim us. I could see the fear in my comrades' eyes, the same fear that gripped my own heart. In that moment, I knew we were facing something beyond our understanding, something ancient and malevolent. The jungle had become our tomb, and the shadows were its guardians. As the last of my comrades disappeared into the darkness, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and everything went black. I woke up to the sound of a chopper overhead. The light of dawn filtered through the dense canopy as I struggled to my feet. I was disoriented, my body aching, and my mind reeling from the events of the night. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the jungle, once menacing in its silence, was now alive with the sounds of the morning. Sergeant Harris was the only other survivor I could see. We were both in rough shape, our uniforms torn, and our faces etched with the terror of what we had experienced. As we stumbled through the underbrush, we heard the voices of our rescuers calling out, cutting through the eerie quiet that had plagued us for so long. The rescue team found us and quickly got us onto the helicopter. As we lifted off, I looked down at the jungle, its dense foliage hiding the horrors we had faced. We were safe, but the relief was bittersweet. Our comrades were still out there, lost to whatever malevolent force had taken them. Despite extensive searches, not a single trace of the missing soldiers was ever found. Back at the base, we were debriefed and questioned endlessly, but our story seemed too incredible to believe. The strange markings, the vanishing soldiers, the shadowy figures, all of it sounded like something out of a nightmare. But for us, it had been all too real. The area where we had patrolled was quickly declared off-limits. The higher-ups didn't want to risk any more lives, and the jungle was marked as a restricted area. Officially, it was due to unexploded ordnance and hazardous terrain, but we knew the real reason. The jungle held secrets that were better left undisturbed. Over the years, stories continued to circulate among the ranks. Patrols that strayed too close to the restricted zone would report strange phenomena, whispers in the wind, unexplainable cold spots, and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures. Despite the warnings, some curious souls ventured into the jungle, never to return. The jungle, once just another dangerous but manageable environment, had become a place of legend and fear. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see the strange markings, hear the whispers, and feel the cold grip of the unknown. The Silent Patrol is a story that haunts me to this day, a reminder that some places are filled with mysteries that should never be uncovered. Story 3: The Vanishing Platoon. I'll never forget the heat. The relentless, oppressive heat of the desert as our platoon moved through the barren landscape on a routine mission. We were stationed in the Mojave Desert, a place that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, with nothing but sand, rocks, and the occasional scrub brush to break the monotony. Our mission was straightforward, a simple reconnaissance to check on some old, abandoned outposts that had been flagged for potential redevelopment. We were well prepared and well equipped, but the desert had a way of making you feel small and vulnerable, no matter how ready you thought you were. Everything was going smoothly until we suddenly lost contact with the base. Our radios, which had been functioning perfectly, went dead in an instant. Static filled our headsets, and all attempts to re-establish communication were futile. It was as if something had cut us off from the outside world entirely. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped sharply. We decided to set up camp and try the radios again in the morning. That's when we first saw the lights. Strange, shimmering lights on the horizon, moving in ways that defied explanation. They weren't the headlights of a vehicle or the flicker of campfires. These lights seemed to dance and hover, almost as if they were alive. Sergeant Reynolds was the first to notice. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, squinting into the distance. We all turned to look, and a chill ran down my spine. The lights were mesmerizing, shifting colors and shapes, drawing us in with their eerie beauty. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. As we approached, the lights seemed to retreat, always staying just out of reach. We pressed on, driven by a mix of fascination and dread. The further we went, the more disoriented we became. The landscape around us seemed to change subtly, as if the desert itself was shifting beneath our feet. Suddenly, the lights vanished, plunging us into an almost unnatural darkness. We stopped, realizing we had wandered far from our camp. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and the silence was deafening. Our flashlights cut through the night, but the familiar landmarks had disappeared. It was as if we had been transported to another world entirely. Panic set in as we tried to find our way back, but nothing looked right. The desert, usually so featureless, now felt like a labyrinth. We called out to each other, our voices tinged with fear, but the only response was the howling wind. We were truly alone, cut off from everything and everyone. The situation went from bad to worse as we tried to find our way back to camp. Our equipment started to malfunction, compasses spinning wildly, GPS units showing nonsense coordinates, and even our flashlights flickering despite fresh batteries. It felt like the desert itself was conspiring against us, warping reality in subtle but terrifying ways. As we pressed on, the hallucinations began. At first, they were small, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. But then they grew more intense. Private Walker swore he saw figures moving among the dunes, ghostly shapes that vanished when you looked directly at them. Corporal Davis started talking about hearing whispers, faint but persistent, calling his name from somewhere in the dark. We were all on edge, our nerves frayed by the unrelenting heat and the eerie silence. Every step felt like a struggle against an unseen force. Our minds were playing tricks on us, and it was becoming harder to tell what was real and what was an illusion. Then, out of nowhere, we stumbled upon something that none of us could have anticipated, an abandoned village. The buildings were ancient, made of stone and partially buried by the shifting sands. There were no signs of life, but the structures were remarkably well preserved, as if they had been abandoned suddenly and recently. We moved cautiously through the village, our senses on high alert. The place had an eerie, timeless quality, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, symbols that none of us recognized. It was as if we had stepped into another era, a forgotten chapter of history that had somehow remained hidden in the desert. Sergeant Reynolds was the first to speak. "This isn't on any of our maps," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" As we explored further, we found signs of an ancient civilization, pottery shards, tools, even what looked like a ceremonial altar. It was clear that this village had once been a thriving community, but now it was nothing more than a ghost town, swallowed by the sands of time. The discovery should have been exciting, a treasure trove of history, but all I felt was dread. The air was thick with tension, and the hallucinations continued to plague us. Shadows moved at the edges of our vision, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the very ground we stood on was haunted by the spirits of the past. We tried to document what we found, taking photos and marking our location, but our equipment continued to fail. It was like the village itself didn't want to be recorded, didn't want to be known. And then, just as suddenly as we had found it, the village seemed to close in around us, the sand and shadows blending together until we could no longer see the way out. We were trapped, surrounded by the remnants of a forgotten world, with no way to call for help and no idea if we would ever see the outside world again. By this point, fear had taken a firm grip on us. The strange village, the hallucinations, and the sense of being watched, it was all too much. We were trained soldiers, but this was something far beyond any of our experiences. We needed to get out, to escape this nightmare. We tried to retrace our steps, but the village seemed to shift and change around us. Every path led us back to where we started, and the whispers grew louder, more desperate. Some of the guys started breaking down, their minds unable to cope with the relentless, unseen pressure. Then, everything went black. I don't remember how long we were out, but when I came to, I was lying in the desert, staring up at the sky. The sun was blazing, and the village was gone. I looked around and saw a few of my comrades, all in a similar state of confusion and exhaustion. There was no sign of the ancient ruins, no markings, nothing. Just endless sand. We managed to stumble back to a known location where a search team found us. We were dehydrated, disoriented, and had no clear memory of how we had escaped or what had happened during those missing hours. Our equipment was dead, and any recordings we had tried to make were corrupted beyond recovery. Back at the base, we were debriefed extensively. Our superiors were skeptical, and frankly, we sounded insane. How could an entire ancient village just disappear? They wrote it off as heat stroke and mass hallucination, but we knew better. We had seen it, felt it. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the experience. I requested satellite images of the area, desperate to prove that what we saw was real. But when the images came back, they showed nothing, just an expanse of empty desert where the village had been. No ruins, no markings, nothing to indicate that anyone had ever been there. To this day, I can't explain what happened. It's like the village was never there, or it slipped out of our reality as quickly as it appeared. Those of us who survive rarely speak of it. It's a memory that haunts me, a mystery that will never be solved. The desert holds its secrets close, and some things are better left undiscovered. Story 4, The Phantom Radio Operator. When I was stationed at a remote military base in Alaska, I spent many long nights in the communication bunker. The bunker was a claustrophobic space, filled with rows of radio equipment, humming with static and the occasional crackle of a transmission. It was our lifeline, connecting us to the outside world in the isolated, freezing wilderness. We worked in shifts, ensuring that someone was always there to monitor the airwaves. It was usually pretty routine, checking in with patrols, relaying messages, and listening for any distress calls. But one night, something happened that none of us could explain. It was a quiet night, with nothing but the usual static and the occasional chatter from other units. I was halfway through my shift when the radio crackled to life. "This is Alpha Bravo 9, requesting immediate assistance." "Repeat, requesting immediate assistance." The voice was frantic, filled with desperation. I grabbed a mic and responded, "This is Base Command, we read you." "What's your location, Alpha Bravo 9? There was a pause, then the voice came back, more urgent this time. "Coordinates 073 926. We're under heavy fire. Need evac." I jotted down the coordinates and relayed the message to my commanding officer. But something wasn't right. Those coordinates didn't match any of our known positions. I double-checked the map, but there was nothing there, just a stretch of barren tundra. My CO was puzzled too. "Who's Alpha Bravo 9? He asked. We didn't have any unit by that designation on the base or in the area. We tried to raise them again, but there was no response. The radio fell silent, leaving us with nothing but questions. As the night wore on, we continued to monitor the frequency, but the distress calls only grew more frequent and more desperate. "We're losing men out here. Please, anyone, respond." The fear in the voice was palpable, but every attempt to contact them was met with silence. We ran a full check on our equipment, thinking it might be a malfunction or some kind of interference. But everything was in perfect working order. It was as if the calls were coming from another world, a ghostly echo from a battle that didn't exist. The next morning, we reported the incident up the chain of command. A search team was dispatched to the coordinates given by Alpha Bravo 9, but they found nothing, no signs of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. It was as if the unit had never been there. The distress calls stopped as suddenly as they had begun, but the experience left us all shaken. We started digging into the base's history and discovered something chilling. Decades ago, during World War II, a unit had gone missing in the exact area we had received the calls from. They were presumed dead, lost to the harsh Alaskan wilderness, and their calls for help had never been answered. It was as if the ghosts of Alpha Bravo 9 were still out there, trapped in time, desperately trying to reach someone who could save them. To this day, I can still hear their voices in the static, a haunting reminder that some parts of the past never truly fade away. As the days passed, the distress calls from Alpha Bravo 9 continued to haunt us. Each night, like clockwork, the frantic pleas for help would echo through our communication bunker. We were desperate to trace the source, but every attempt led to dead ends. We used every tool at our disposal: signal triangulation, frequency analysis, even consulting old records and maps, but nothing added up. The coordinates provided were in the middle of nowhere, and there was no evidence of any unit operating in that area, past or present. Our equipment, which had always been reliable, began to malfunction at the most critical moments. Radios would short out, frequencies would scramble, and our transmissions would inexplicably fail to go through. One night, after another round of fruitless searching, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I volunteered to go out to the coordinates myself. My commanding officer was reluctant but eventually agreed, assigning Private Larson to accompany me. We geared up and headed out, braving the harsh Alaskan night. The drive was eerie. The landscape was bathed in an otherworldly glow from the moon, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift. The closer we got to the coordinates, the more oppressive the silence became. The usual sounds of the wilderness, howling wind, creaking trees, seemed to vanish, leaving only an unsettling stillness. When we arrived, we found nothing but snow and ice. No signs of life, no tracks, nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. We set up our equipment and tried to make contact, but the radios were dead. Frustrated, I scanned the area with my flashlight, hoping for any clue. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the swirling snow, standing a few yards away. I called out, but there was no response. The figure remained still, almost as if it was waiting. Larson and I approached cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. As we got closer, the figure came into focus. It was a soldier, his uniform tattered and his face gaunt. He looked like he had been through hell. His eyes, hollow and haunted, met mine. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, I felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow and desperation wash over me. Alpha Bravo 9? I whispered, my voice trembling. The soldier nodded slowly, his expression one of infinite sadness. He raised his arm and pointed towards a nearby ridge. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. When I turned back, the soldier was gone. Larson and I were left standing in the snow, stunned and shaken. We searched the area thoroughly but found no trace of the soldier or any other signs of life. We returned to the base, our minds reeling from what we had just experienced. The distress call stopped after that night, but the memory of the ghostly soldier stayed with me. We reported our encounter, but it was met with skepticism. Officially, it was chalked up to stress and the harsh conditions playing tricks on our minds. But I knew what I had seen. To this day, I believe that the soldier was one of the lost men from Alpha Bravo 9, trapped in some kind of limbo, reaching out for help that never came. The experience changed me, a haunting reminder of the past's unyielding grip on the present. The ghost of that soldier still lingers in my thoughts, a silent plea for answers that may never be found. After that night in the snow, I couldn't shake the image of the ghostly soldier. Back at the base, I dug into the archives, determined to find out who he was. What I discovered left me cold. Decades ago, during the height of the Cold War, a radio operator named Corporal James Fletcher had been stationed in our bunker. One night, during a severe storm, a freak accident caused an electrical fire in the bunker. Fletcher was trapped and died before help could arrive. His death had always been shrouded in mystery, with some claiming they could still hear his voice over the radio. I realized that the distress calls we had been receiving were from him, reaching out from beyond the grave, stuck in a loop, desperately trying to contact someone to save him. I brought this information to my commanding officer. After some deliberation, it was decided that the bunker should be sealed off. It was too dangerous, and the eerie disturbances were affecting morale. We gathered one last time in the bunker to shut everything down. As we powered up the equipment, the familiar crackle of the radio filled the room one last time. "This is Alpha Bravo 9, requesting immediate assistance," the voice pleaded, now more of a mournful whisper. We held a small, impromptu ceremony for Corporal Fletcher, hoping it might bring some peace to his restless spirit. The bunker doors were welded shut, and the area was marked as off-limits. Life at the base gradually returned to normal, but those of us who had been there knew the truth. The story doesn't end there, though. Weeks later, while on night shift in the new communication room, I heard it again. The faint, crackling plea for help from Alpha Bravo 9. My blood ran cold. Despite the bunker being sealed, the calls continued, as if Corporal Fletcher's spirit had found a new way to reach out. To this day, the calls occasionally come through, always the same desperate message, always at night. The new operators are puzzled but dismiss it as interference or a prank. But those of us who know the story understand. Corporal Fletcher is still out there, trapped in his final moments, forever trying to contact the living from beyond the grave. The phantom radio operator remains a chilling reminder that some spirits never find rest, and some voices can never be silenced. Story 5, The Unseen Enemy. I was part of a special forces unit conducting a training exercise deep in the Black Forest in Germany. The dense canopy of trees and the rugged terrain made it the perfect place for honing our survival skills and tactical maneuvers. The forest, with its towering pines and thick underbrush, was both beautiful and intimidating, providing an ideal setting for our drills. Our unit was well prepared and highly skilled, accustomed to facing challenging environments and situations. We set up camp in a small clearing and began our exercises. The first few days were routine, filled with navigation challenges, stealth maneuvers, and simulated combat scenarios. But on the third night, things took a strange turn. As we sat around the campfire, exchanging stories and planning for the next day's exercises, we started to feel an unsettling presence. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation on the back of our necks, as if we were being watched. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of wildlife, had grown eerily silent. Corporal Miller was the first to voice what we were all thinking. Do you guys feel that? Like someone's out there watching us? We all nodded, glancing nervously into the surrounding darkness. The feeling of being observed was growing stronger, making it hard to concentrate. Then, we started hearing the whispers. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder and more persistent. It was as if the forest itself was alive, speaking to us in a language we couldn't understand. We tried to brush it off as our minds playing tricks, but the whispers continued, unnerving even the most stoic among us. Private Sanchez, who had the first watch that night, reported seeing shadows moving just beyond the firelight. I swear, I saw something out there, he whispered, his voice shaking. Something big and fast. We dismissed it as the play of light and shadow, but the unease lingered. The next day, the whispers continued, even in broad daylight. As we moved through the forest, we kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of our eyes. Shadows flitted between the trees, always staying just out of sight. We doubled our vigilance, but no matter how hard we looked, we couldn't find any signs of another presence. That night, things escalated. As we prepared for sleep, the whispers turned into voices, clear and disconcerting. They called our names, mimicking the voices of our comrades, luring us deeper into the forest. We took turns keeping watch, but sleep was impossible with the voices in our ears and the feeling of being watched gnawing in our nerves. By dawn, we were exhausted and on edge. It was clear that something was out there, something we couldn't explain. We decided to cut our training short and return to base. But as we packed up camp, we realized that the forest had other plans. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the whispers turned into mocking laughter. We were no longer just training. We were being hunted by an unseen enemy that seemed to know our every move. Our decision to cut the training short was unanimous. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable, and the whispers were driving us to the brink of madness. We packed up quickly, each of us glancing nervously into the forest, half expecting something to leap out at us. As we moved through the forest, the whispers grew louder, turning into taunting voices that echoed in our minds. Shadows flitted between the trees, and we kept seeing movement just at the edge of our vision. The tension was palpable, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. Suddenly, Private Sanchez screamed and vanished into the underbrush. We rushed to where he had been, but there was no trace of him, just the echoes of his scream lingering in the air. Panic set in as we realized we were being hunted, picked off one by an enemy we couldn't see. Sergeant Thompson, our unit leader, ordered us to form a tight perimeter and move quickly. But the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer together, making it difficult to navigate. We stumbled through the underbrush, our nerves frayed, as more of our team disappeared into the shadows. It was like a nightmare come to life. We were no longer soldiers on a training mission. We were prey, trying to survive against an unseen predator. The forest, once a familiar training ground, had transformed into a hostile, living entity intent on our destruction. As we neared a small clearing, the whispers reached a fever pitch, turning into a cacophony of mocking laughter and taunts. We were down to just a few soldiers, and our morale was shattered. Then, in a sudden, horrifying moment, the unseen enemy struck. Sergeant Thompson was lifted off the ground by an invisible force and thrown into a tree with bone-crunching force. He slumped to the ground, unconscious. I watched in terror as a dark, shadowy figure materialized in the clearing. It was humanoid but twisted and malformed, its features obscured by a dark haze. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural energy. Driven by a mix of fear and desperation, I grabbed Thompson's sidearm and charged at the figure. It moved with impossible speed, dodging my attacks effortlessly. It felt like I was fighting a ghost. Each time I struck, my blows passed through it as if it was made of smoke. But then, something changed. As I fought, I remembered the stories of ancient spirits and curses that haunted these woods. Summoning all my courage, I yelled at the top of my lungs, "Leave us alone. We mean no harm." For a moment, the figure paused, its form flickering. I could feel its cold, hollow eyes on me. It seemed to consider my words, then slowly began to dissipate, melting back into the shadows from which it had come. The whispers faded, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I rushed to Sergeant Thompson's side, helping him to his feet. We gathered the remaining soldiers and made our way out of the forest as quickly as possible. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of our base. Back at the base, we reported everything, but our superiors dismissed it as stress-induced hallucinations and fatigue. But we knew the truth. Something ancient and malevolent lived in that forest, something that preyed on the unwary. The Black Forest, with its beauty and mystery, held secrets that were best left undisturbed. Even now, I can still hear the whispers in my nightmares, reminding me of the unseen enemy that lurks in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. We didn't stop running until we were well clear of the forest. The relief of seeing the base in the distance was overwhelming. We stumbled in, exhausted and shaken, each of us bearing the marks of our ordeal. The remaining soldiers managed to escape, but the sense of being hunted never left us. We were alive, but the threat that had stalked us remained a mystery. Back at the base, we were debriefed. Our superiors were skeptical, attributing our experiences to stress and exhaustion. They ordered us to keep quiet about the details, fearing the story would cause unnecessary panic. But we knew what we had seen, what we had felt. The forest was haunted by something ancient and malevolent, something that defied all rational explanation. In the weeks that followed, life at the base returned to a semblance of normalcy, but we were changed. The experience had left a deep scar on our psyche. The forest, once a place of training and discipline, had become a symbol of terror and the unknown. Then, the dreams began. At first, they were just fragmented images, flashes of the forest, the shadows moving among the trees, the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as time passed, the dreams became more vivid, more real. It was as if the forest was calling us back, pulling us into its dark embrace, night after night. Years later, I ran into one of the soldiers who had been with me during that fateful training exercise. We shared a drink and, inevitably, the conversation turned to the forest. He admitted that he had been having the same dreams, the same haunting images. It was a relief to know I wasn't alone, but it also confirmed my deepest fears. We started reaching out to others from our unit, and the pattern was clear. Every one of us had been plagued by the same dreams. It was as if the forest had left a mark on us, a connection that time and distance couldn't sever. Some of the guys reported waking up in a cold sweat, hearing the whispers even when they were miles away from the forest. The strangest part? Some of us started seeing the forest in places it shouldn't be. Walking down a city street, I would catch a glimpse of the trees out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing. Others reported similar experiences, brief, fleeting images of the forest appearing in their daily lives, always just at the edge of their vision. We still don't know what we encountered in that forest, and maybe we never will. The official reports remain unchanged, dismissing our experiences as the result of stress and exhaustion. But those of us who were there know the truth. The forest, with its unseen enemy, is still out there, watching and waiting. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear the whispers, reminding me that some secrets are never meant to be uncovered. And there you have it, 5 chilling tales of military encounters with the unknown. Do you have any terrifying military encounters or supernatural experiences? Share your own horror stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling tales. Don't forget to visit the Hallowed Hauntings blog for more in-depth stories and insights, and check out our shop for exclusive merchandise that will keep the spirit of these tales alive. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay safe and keep your eyes open, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows.